Rude idiot student disrespects the king's guard. His teachers, classmates, and even his parents had grown used to his sharp tongue and unwillingness to follow rules. John didn't see the point in respecting authority. To him, adults were out of touch, and their rules were just there to keep him down. He didn't mind making a scene if it meant getting attention, and that's exactly what he was going to do today. It was a sunny afternoon when John and his school group arrived at the historical site. The class was on a field trip, and their destination was a famous castle that had stood for centuries. It was known for its architecture, its historical significance, and of course, its royal connection. The King's Guard had been stationed there for as long as anyone could remember, standing watch in their iconic uniforms, ever silent, ever vigilant. John had no interest in history. To him, castles were just old buildings, and kings were just old men who had long lost their power. He thought the whole thing was boring. His mind was already wandering to thoughts of what he'd be doing after the trip, maybe meeting up with his friends or playing video games. But when the group arrived at the castle, something caught his eye. There they were, the King's Guard. Dressed in their ceremonial uniforms, they stood like statues, each man tall and immovable, their faces as cold and unreadable as the stone walls around them. John sneered at them. He couldn't understand why anyone would want to live like that, standing still for hours on end, never speaking, just watching. It seemed pointless, even a little ridiculous to him. With his usual mischievous grin, John decided he would have a little fun. He nudged his friend Tommy, who was standing beside him, and whispered, "Watch this." Without thinking about the consequences, he walked over to one of the guards, a tall man who looked like he hadn't moved an inch for hours. John wasn't sure if the man was alive or just a very convincing mannequin, but that didn't stop him from making a comment. "Hey, you ever get tired of standing there all day like a statue?" John said, loud enough for a few people to hear. The guard didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his cap. John laughed, nudging his friend again. "I mean, what's the point? You're not even allowed to talk. What kind of life is that?" The guard still didn't move, but John was undeterred. He took a few steps around him, inspecting the man's uniform. It was pristine, as it should be for a member of the King's Guard, but to John, it seemed almost comical. "What's with all the shiny buttons? You look like a Christmas tree." A few people in the crowd giggled, some even whispered among themselves. John was pleased with the attention. He had always liked being the center of it all, and this was no different. He continued his teasing, making a joke about how he could never stand still for that long, how he'd fall asleep in the middle of it. "You probably have to stand like this for hours, huh? It's like a prison sentence. I'd lose my mind." Finally, after a few moments of complete silence, the guard spoke. His voice was calm and steady, without a hint of anger. "I'm here to protect history, young man," he said, his eyes still fixed forward. "It's more than just standing still. It's about responsibility, discipline, and respect." John smirked, not at all impressed. He didn't believe in all that respect nonsense. To him, it sounded like a bunch of old-fashioned ideas that didn't mean anything. "Respect," he scoffed, "for standing around. If I were you, I'd be looking for something more exciting to do." At this, some of the other tourists looked uncomfortable, but John didn't care. He was used to making people uncomfortable, especially adults. To him, they were all just too serious, too stiff. But the guard, instead of getting angry, responded in a way that John didn't expect. His tone remained calm, almost as if he were talking to a child who didn't understand yet. "Sometimes, standing still is harder than it seems. But the weight of that responsibility makes everything else seem trivial. Perhaps one day you'll understand." John felt a slight pang of discomfort but quickly brushed it off. He wasn't about to let one guard ruin his fun. "Yeah, sure," he said, rolling his eyes. "Maybe when I'm old and boring like you." The class had gathered around by now, and John noticed that some of his classmates were watching him, waiting to see how he would react. They were used to his antics, but there was something different in the way they were looking at him this time. Maybe it was because they could see that the guard wasn't getting rattled. John turned around to face his friends, ready to make another joke. But just as he opened his mouth, he noticed something that made him pause. The guard wasn't looking at him anymore. His face remained impassive, but John could tell that there was something deeper behind those eyes. Something about the calmness in the guard's demeanor made John feel small, almost like he was being judged in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time, John felt the weight of what he had just said. It wasn't just an annoying joke anymore. The guard's words about responsibility and respect lingered in the air, like a challenge that John wasn't ready to face. But before John could process his thoughts further, the teacher called for the class to move on to the next part of the tour. He reluctantly turned his back on the guard, a little shaken but not ready to admit it. The crowd moved forward, but John's mind remained stuck on that brief moment, the stillness of the guard, the quiet strength in his voice. As the class walked away, John found himself looking back at the guard. Something about the encounter gnawed at him, but he couldn't figure out what. All he knew was that this wasn't over. It couldn't be. And as he turned to walk ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that deep down he just made a mistake. John walked away, trying to act like he hadn't just been rattled by the guard's calm response. He threw a smirk at Tommy, as if everything was still under control. But in the back of his mind, something kept nagging at him. Why had the guard's words affected him more than he was willing to admit? Was it the way the guard didn't flinch, didn't even seem to care about his mockery? That bothered John. It bothered him a lot. As the class moved from one part of the castle to another, John found it hard to focus. He kept glancing back over his shoulder toward the spot where the guard still stood, unmoving. It was almost like the man was waiting for something, waiting for John to come back. But John didn't want to face that, not yet. He wanted to forget about it, but he couldn't. The guard's words echoed in his mind. Perhaps one day you'll understand. The afternoon passed, but John's attention was elsewhere. He barely paid attention to the guide's explanations about the castle's history or the significance of the king's throne room. His mind kept wandering back to the encounter with the guard. Why had the man been so calm, so composed? John prided himself on his ability to get under people's skin, but this guard was different. He wasn't playing by the same rules, and that made him even more frustrating. When the class stopped for a break, John pulled Tommy aside, his brow furrowed in thought. "What do you think of that guy?" John asked, his voice lower than usual. "The guard, he's a weirdo, right?" Tommy shrugged. "I don't know, he didn't say much, but he didn't seem to care about what you said." "Exactly," John said, his frustration growing. "That's what bugs me. Everyone else reacts when I make fun of them. They get mad or embarrassed, but he didn't even blink." He kicked at the ground, annoyed. "It's like he didn't even hear me." Tommy laughed. "Maybe you didn't get to him, man. Or maybe he just didn't think you were worth his time." "It's kind of impressive, actually," John scoffed. "Yeah, well, it's just weird. It's like he was too good for me to get under his skin. I don't like it." Tommy raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything more. The group soon gathered again, and John reluctantly joined them. But his thoughts were still with the guard. He couldn't help but keep sneaking glances at the man standing by the castle gates, perfectly still, like a living statue. It was hard to believe that someone could stand there for hours with such focus. John couldn't even sit still for a few minutes without getting bored. Just before the tour ended, something unexpected happened. As the class was about to leave the castle grounds, John's teacher suggested they take a group photo. Everyone crowded around, trying to fit into the frame, but as John was trying to get in position, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning around, he came face to face with the very guard he had mocked earlier. His expression was still neutral, but there was a slight shift in his posture. It wasn't threatening, but there was a certain authority about him now. John froze. He hadn't expected this. Was the guard going to scold him? Was he going to get in trouble? Instead, the guard's voice was calm but firm. "You're leaving already?" he asked, as if he'd been waiting for John to make the first move. John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't sure why he was nervous. After all, this was the same guy he had been mocking all day. But there was something about the guard's quiet presence that made him feel small. "Yeah, the trip's over," John said, trying to sound casual, though his voice came out more uncertain than he'd intended. He took a step back, unsure of how to handle the situation. The guard didn't seem angry. He didn't seem anything at all, just still. John couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. The guard tilted his head slightly. "You know," he said, "standing still isn't as easy as it looks. People think it's simple, but it takes patience, focus, and control. It's a lot harder than most people think." John wanted to brush him off, to crack another joke, but there was something in the guard's voice, something steady and unshakable, that made it hard for John to make fun of him anymore. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The guard wasn't mocking him or laughing at him. He wasn't even angry. He was simply being. "Sometimes it's easy to disrespect what you don't understand," the guard continued, his tone not scolding but thoughtful. "But real strength isn't about making others look small. It's about having the patience to stand firm, even when everything around you is moving." John felt a strange sensation in his chest, like something was shifting. Was the guard trying to teach him something? Was he making sense? Before John could answer, the guard stepped back as if to give him space. "I won't expect you to understand now," he said. "But maybe one day you will." And then, just like that, he turned away and resumed his position by the gates, as if their conversation had never happened. John stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot. His classmates had already gathered by the bus, eager to head home, but he couldn't move. The words the guard had spoken were still echoing in his mind. Real strength isn't about making others look small. The bus ride home was long, and John sat in silence, staring out the window. He replayed the conversation over and over in his mind, wondering what the guard had meant. Was he talking about him? John wasn't used to being talked to like that, like someone actually cared enough to try and teach him something. Usually, adults just dismissed him like he was a lost cause. But this guard, he was different, and John wasn't sure if he liked it or not. As the bus pulled into his neighborhood, John realized he had more questions than answers. Maybe he didn't have all the answers right now, but something about that encounter had planted a seed in his mind. It wasn't just about the guard. It was about how John saw the world, how he had always seen the world. Maybe he had been wrong all along. Maybe it was time to start looking at things a little differently. He didn't have the courage to admit it just yet, but for the first time, he was starting to wonder if the world had more to offer than just defiance and rebellion. And maybe, just maybe, he'd have to learn to stand still for a while. The next few days were difficult for John. It wasn't that anything big had happened, but his mind kept drifting back to that one encounter with the king's guard. His friends had all forgotten about it by now, laughing about other things and moving on with their lives. But John couldn't stop thinking about the calm way the guard had spoken to him. Real strength isn't about making others look small. The words echoed in his mind, even when he was in class or hanging out with his friends. He'd never been the type to let something bother him, but this time it was different. The words felt heavy. They made him question everything he had believed about power and strength. John had always thought that real strength came from being in control, from showing people who was boss, from putting others down when they got in your way. He'd always relied on his sharp tongue and quick wit to get what he wanted, to make people laugh or back off. But the guard hadn't done any of that. He hadn't raised his voice or tried to put John down. He had just stood there. and John couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was more to strength than he had realized. One afternoon, about a week after the field trip, John's curiosity got the better of him. He found himself walking back toward the castle. He hadn't planned on going there, but something inside him made him take the same route. Maybe he was looking for something, an answer, or maybe just a way to quiet the questions in his head. When he arrived, he noticed the guard again, standing in his usual spot, unmoving. John stood at a distance for a moment, watching him. The guard was exactly as he remembered, tall, disciplined, unshakable. There was something almost intimidating about his stillness, like he could see through everyone who passed by. John wasn't sure what had brought him here, but now that he was here, he figured he might as well take a chance. He took a deep breath, walked up to the guard, and stood quietly beside him. The guard didn't acknowledge him at first, but John knew that wasn't the point. He wasn't here to make fun of him again. This time, he just wanted to understand. The minutes passed in silence, and John felt uncomfortable, though he didn't let it show. He'd never been one to just stand still and do nothing. He shifted from foot to foot, trying to stay calm, but it was harder than he expected. He glanced at the guard, who seemed to be completely unfazed by the stillness around him. After a while, the guard turned his head slightly, enough to acknowledge John's presence. "I see you've come back," the guard said, his voice calm as always. John nodded, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to sound too eager or too uncertain, but the words spilled out before he could stop them. "I don't get it. How do you do it? How do you just stand there all day without, well, losing your mind?" The guard's expression remained unchanged, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, maybe amusement, or perhaps something deeper. "It's not about doing, it's about being. You stand still because it's your duty, because you've committed yourself to something greater than just the moment. It's about discipline." John frowned, not fully understanding. "Discipline?" he repeated, testing the word on his tongue. It sounded like something his parents always talked about. His teachers, too, but John had never really paid attention to it. To him, discipline was just a fancy word for doing things you didn't want to do. That doesn't make sense. Why would anyone choose to do something that boring? The guard looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Discipline isn't about doing something boring. It's about understanding your purpose. When you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, everything else falls into place. It's not about the task itself, it's about what that task means." John was quiet for a moment, trying to process what the guard had said. He had always seen discipline as something forced upon him, something to make him behave, to keep him from doing whatever he wanted. But now he was starting to see it in a different light. Maybe the guard was right. Maybe it wasn't about following orders for the sake of following orders. Maybe it was about something deeper, something that gave meaning to the action itself. The guard continued, his voice steady. "The hardest part of discipline isn't standing still. It's resisting the urge to look away when the world around you tries to distract you. It's not easy. It's not supposed to be. But it teaches you to control yourself, and that is where real strength comes from." John felt a shift inside him, like the pieces of a puzzle were starting to click into place. He thought about all the times he'd gotten in trouble, how he had always reacted impulsively, letting his emotions control him. He was always the first to make a joke, the first to snap back when someone insulted him. But maybe, just maybe, the guard was right. Real strength wasn't about reacting. It wasn't about being the loudest or the funniest or the toughest. It was about having the discipline to stay calm, to resist the urge to lash out, and to stand firm even when things didn't go his way. As the guard spoke, John realized he was beginning to admire him. Not just for his strength, but for his calmness, for the way he carried himself with such quiet dignity. It wasn't something John had ever really seen before. It wasn't like the kind of strength that came from winning a fight or making people laugh. It was a strength that came from within, from having the patience and the control to stay still, even when everything around you was moving. After a few moments of silence, the guard spoke again, his voice soft but firm. "Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is nothing at all. But that doesn't mean it's any less important." John nodded, unsure of how to respond. He had come here looking for answers, but now that he had them, he wasn't sure how to feel. He still didn't fully understand everything the guard had said, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the same person who had mocked this man just a few days ago. The guard didn't say anything more. Instead, he turned back to his position, resuming his watch over the castle. John stood there for a moment, watching him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was starting to understand something important. The questions that had been swirling in his mind now seemed less like confusion and more like curiosity. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than reacting. Maybe there was a way to stand firm, to control himself, and to be strong in a way he had never considered before. John didn't know where this new path would take him, but he felt a strange sense of peace. He might not have all the answers, but he was starting to learn what true strength really meant. And for the first time, he was beginning to see it not in others but in himself. The next day, something unexpected happened. John found himself standing outside the castle gates once again, but this time, he wasn't sure why. He had thought about the guard's words for the past week, and the more he thought about them, the more he felt drawn to the idea of learning discipline. But he wasn't sure if he was ready to really understand it. It was one thing to hear someone talk about discipline and patience. It was another to actually live it. John had been restless lately, feeling like something inside him had shifted, but unsure how to put that shift into action. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the guard stood still for hours, his every move measured and controlled. It wasn't just a job to him, it was a way of life. That thought lingered in John's mind. What if he could learn that kind of strength? What if he could develop the patience to stand firm, even when the world tried to pull him in 1,000 different directions? The guard wasn't in his usual spot today, and for a moment, John felt disappointed. He wasn't sure why, but he'd been hoping to see him again, hoping for some kind of answer to the growing questions in his mind. John started to walk away when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and there was the guard emerging from behind the castle wall, his eyes focused and his movements as deliberate as ever. "Looking for someone?" the guard asked, his voice calm but with a hint of amusement. John hesitated, unsure of what to say. He had never really thought about it, but he was looking for something, wasn't he? He was looking for the answers to the questions that had been swirling in his head ever since he'd met this man. I I don't know," John admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I guess I'm just trying to figure things out." The guard looked at him for a moment as if sizing him up. "Figuring things out isn't easy," he said. "Sometimes it takes more than just thinking about it. Sometimes it takes doing." John frowned, confused. "Doing what?" The guard stepped closer, standing a little straighter. "The only way to understand discipline is to experience it, not just hear about it, not just think about it. You have to live it. If you want to know what it means to be truly disciplined, you have to see it for yourself." John felt a surge of frustration. "So, what, you're saying I just need to stand still for hours like you do?" The guard's gaze didn't waver. "If you want to understand what discipline really is, yes. It's not about being bored. It's not about standing still for no reason. It's about being present, being focused. When you stop reacting and start thinking, you begin to see the world differently." John wasn't sure what to say. This wasn't what he expected. He had thought the guard would give him a simple answer, something he could easily wrap his head around. But this was more than he had bargained for. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but part of him knew that he had to try. He couldn't keep running from his curiosity. "Okay," John said finally, his voice steady. "I'll give it a try, but you're not going to make me stand here for hours, right?" The guard's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, I won't make you stand here for hours. But you will have to stand still for a while. It's part of the lesson. You need to feel what it's like to be still and focused. Only then can you understand the true strength behind it. John took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Standing still didn't sound so hard, but something told him it would be harder than it seemed. He stepped up beside the guard, trying to match his stance. He tried to stay as still as the guard, but after just a few minutes, his legs began to ache. His arms felt heavy. His mind kept wandering to all the other things he could be doing, all the distractions in the world that seemed so much more interesting than standing still. But the guard didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching the world go by, his focus unwavering. John shifted uncomfortably, but the guard's voice broke the silence. You're not going to learn anything if you keep moving. If you want to understand what it takes to be disciplined, you need to be willing to stay in one place. Focus your mind. Focus your body. Everything else can wait. John tried to focus. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise around him. But it wasn't easy. His mind kept racing, filled with thoughts of everything he had to do. He was used to constantly moving, constantly reacting, constantly being on the go. Standing still felt unnatural, like he was fighting against his own instincts. As the minutes ticked by, John's frustration grew. His legs were sore and his mind kept drifting. It felt impossible to stay still. He wanted to give up, to walk away, to do anything but stand there. But then, something shifted inside him. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the quiet strength of the guard beside him, or maybe it was the realization that he wasn't going to get anywhere by running from this challenge. Whatever it was, he decided to push through. He closed his eyes again, taking a deep breath. This time he focused on the feeling of his feet on the ground. He focused on the rhythm of his breath. Slowly, the rest of the world started to fade away. It wasn't easy, but he was beginning to understand. It wasn't just about standing still. It was about being present, about quieting the chaos in his mind, about letting go of all the distractions that constantly pulled at him. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever, but John kept going. The discomfort didn't go away, but he learned to ignore it. Slowly, he began to feel a sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. For the first time in a long time, John felt like he was doing something that mattered. Not because it was easy, but because it was hard, because it required patience and focus, because it required him to be still. After what felt like an eternity, the guard spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough for today. How do you feel?" John opened his eyes and looked at him. For the first time, he could see it clearly. The guard wasn't just standing still for no reason. He wasn't just following orders. He was there because he had a purpose. He was focused. He was disciplined. And in that moment, John realized something important. Discipline wasn't about following rules just for the sake of following rules. It was about having a purpose, having the strength to stay focused, even when everything else around you was pulling at you. "I think I get it now," John said, his voice quieter than before. "It's not about standing still. It's about being present. It's about focus." The guard nodded, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Exactly. And now that you understand that, you can start to build the strength to control yourself. It's not easy. It never will be. But if you can stay focused, if you can stay disciplined, then you can handle anything that comes your way." John didn't know if he was ready to live by those words just yet, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present, about learning to control himself, to stay still when the world around him was moving fast. As John walked away from the castle that day, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from avoiding challenges. It was the kind that came from facing them head-on and learning to be still in the midst of them. It was the peace that came from discipline. Weeks passed since John's last lesson with the king's guard, and something inside him had changed. He wasn't sure exactly when it happened, but he could feel it. He wasn't the same person he used to be. Every time he found himself facing a challenge, whether at school or with his friends, he remembered the guard's words. He remembered standing still, focusing, being present. The chaos in his mind had quieted, and though it didn't always come easy, John was learning to approach things with a different mindset. John had started spending more time at the castle, returning almost every day after school. It wasn't because he had nothing else to do, it was because he felt drawn there. The lessons were subtle, almost like a quiet hum in the back of his mind, but they were there. He started to understand what the guard had meant when he talked about discipline, focus, and presence. It wasn't just about standing still for hours on end. It was about finding peace within yourself, no matter the storm outside. One afternoon, as John sat on a bench near the castle gates, he saw the guard again. The man was standing in his usual spot, unmoving, watching the world pass by. But this time, John didn't feel irritated or frustrated. He didn't feel like making fun of him. He just felt calm. He had spent enough time reflecting to know that the guard was just someone to admire from a distance. He had learned that real strength came not from showing off or proving something to others, but from knowing yourself, from understanding the power of your own presence. The guard noticed him sitting there and approached without a word. There was a quiet understanding between them now. The guard didn't need to say much. John knew exactly what he was thinking, but for some reason he wanted to say something. "You were right," John said, looking up at the guard. "About everything, about the stillness, about being present, I get it now." The guard didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, his gaze steady. It was as if he already knew the transformation John was going through, and he didn't need to say anything more. "I used to think strength was about being loud, about getting people's attention. I thought it was about being the one who always had the last word or who could make everyone laugh. But now I see it's about control. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to move and when to stand still." The guard's expression softened just a little. "You're learning," he said. "Strength comes in many forms. It's not about making yourself bigger or more powerful than others. It's about understanding your own limits, your own purpose. Knowing when to act and when to stay still is a kind of wisdom. A wisdom that doesn't come from reacting to the world around you, but from understanding the world within you." John thought about those words as they lingered in the air. It wasn't just about the guard's lessons. It was about his own journey. He had learned to stand still, but that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The real test of discipline wasn't about the physical act of standing still. It was about carrying that stillness with him in every aspect of his life. John had been quick to react before, quick to fight back, quick to prove himself. But now he was learning to pause, to think, to understand the bigger picture. And in that pause, he discovered a strength that was far greater than anything he had ever known. As the days passed, John noticed a change in the way he interacted with others. At school, he didn't feel the need to argue or make jokes to cover up his insecurities. He still had the same sharp wit, but he used it more wisely. When someone challenged him, he didn't feel the need to lash out or defend himself right away. Instead, he took a breath, thought about his response, and then spoke. And when he did speak, people listened. Even his friends noticed the difference. Tommy, who had always been the one to egg John on during their pranks or teasing, started to see the change too. One afternoon after school, Tommy raised an eyebrow as they walked together. "You've been different lately," Tommy said. "You've been quieter, more calm. What's up with that?" John shrugged, but there was a calmness in his movements now. "I don't know, I think I've learned a few things about myself, about what really matters." Tommy didn't press him for more details, but John could tell he was curious, and that was enough. He wasn't doing this for anyone else's approval. He was doing it for himself. For the first time, John wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply trying to be the best version of himself. The weeks turned into months, and John found himself returning to the castle less frequently. Not because he had stopped learning, but because he had started to take what he had learned with him into the world. He didn't need to stand in front of the guards to practice his discipline. He was living it now. Every day, every moment was a chance to apply the lessons he had learned. One evening, as John passed by the castle on his way home from school, he saw the guard once more. The man was still as ever, standing in his place, watching the horizon with the same quiet strength. This time, John didn't feel the need to approach him or say anything. He simply paused for a moment, letting the stillness wash over him. There was no need for words anymore. He had already learned what he needed to learn. The guard's eyes briefly met John's, and for a second there was an unspoken understanding between them. The guard nodded, acknowledging the growth John had made. And with that, John continued on his way, his heart lighter, his steps more confident. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first mocked the guard. He was stronger now, not because he had learned to stand still, but because he had learned how to be present. He had learned how to control himself, how to find peace in the chaos of life. And though his journey wasn't over, John knew one thing for certain. True strength wasn't about impressing others. It was about impressing yourself. And as he walked home that evening, John felt a sense of calm he had never known before. The world around him was still loud, still chaotic, but he had found a way to stay grounded, a way to stand firm in the midst of it all.